I mentioned at the start of the show we have a guest joining us, and I just love it. First of all, I'll show you her book. This is her book. It's called Backlash. You can see that, and her name is Helen Raleigh. Backlash is the book, How China's Aggression Has Backfired. And very briefly, oh, that's a much better image. Thank you. There's the book. It's a beautiful cover, by the way. Beautiful cover. But I want to talk briefly about Helen Raleigh. She was born in China, came to the United States as a student in 1996. She's a naturalized citizen here in America. Her first book, which as I was reading about this morning, I'm thinking this is the book I want to read next. Her first book, Confucius Never Said, was a book published in 2015, which basically tracks her family's 4 generations of her family and their journey from repression and poverty in China to freedom and prosperity in America. But the reason I thought it sounded so interesting was it talks about her family's lives in China having overlap with many significant historical events taking place in China, such as the founding of Communist China in 1949, the Great Chinese Famine, the Cultural Revolution, and the economic reforms starting from 1980. So that sounds like a great book. And she has another book, which is called The Broken Welcome Mat, about America's immigration system. But this book, which we'll be talking about today, called Backlash, is about how China's... there's so many things it's about, I can't even tell you. A lot of history of China, explanation of their culture, their governance, the way the Communist Party thinks. And in this book, she actually goes into a lot of questions that touch on today's American foreign policy. So we're going to talk with Helen Raleigh, and we have her, I believe, on Skype to talk about her new book, Backlash, How China's Aggression Has Backfired. And there she is. Hi, Helen.
Hi, Debbie. How are you?
I'm well, and I'm so happy to see you. Okay, so I have a lot of questions about your book, and I want to just dive right in, okay? Okay, so to start with, your book, I like that it is divided in parts. Very logical, it's very helpful. And one of the early things I want to hit on, and we've talked about this on my show before with other scholars related to China, but I want to have you tell our listeners again, or tell them in your view, this view of people, especially Xi Jinping now, the leader in China, but historically also, anciently historically, this view among some Chinese people that the Chinese people themselves are intended to be essentially the one world power. They are intended ultimately to have the rulers of the world. And I know that sounds a dramatic way to say it. Maybe you can explain it better. But there's a philosophy there I'd love to have you explain.
Right. So in China's ancient feudal system, the emperor was considered the son of the heaven. He's the connection, divine connection between heaven and everything on earth. And so the word China in Chinese means the center. So there is a belief that China supposed to be the center of the universe, and the ruler, the emperor, is the ruler of the universe. And so obviously in the last 100 years, that through the Opium War and through the communist rules, that China's economies and the national power deteriorated. But now the communist leader Xi Jinping used the so-called China dream, basically want to reclaim this vision that China should replace United States as a rightful place for China, for communist China, is to be the next world hegemon and be the, create the new world order that is centered around China.
It is truly amazing because I think that there was, America spent a long period of time in terms of our foreign policy trying to bring China, communist China, kind of onto the world playing field more, thinking that there were more interaction, more trade, more negotiation, all that we would help China bring itself kind of more into the Western world and maybe inspire the Communist Party leaders to tamp down on communism, to open their economy, their society more. And that really didn't work. That really backfired. Can you explain why that was, why that didn't work with China?
Well, because it was based, this approach that the engagement somehow will bring a natural, more democratic, liberal change is based on illusion. It's based on misunderstanding of the true nature of the Communist Party. So the Chinese Communist Party is ideologically and historically hostile to the liberal world order. And it believes that the liberal world order is a threat to the Communist Party's survival. And to the Communist Party, there's nothing is more important than its survival. And we know, based on we look at the history of China, history of Soviet Union, the communist rule is very authoritarian, sometimes going into totalitarian. So it's a very different ideology compared to totalitarianism. Therefore, no matter how much engagement that the West liberal countries that try to engage with China, no matter how much commerce we have, which is very obvious now that after 30 years of economic engagement, China today, China used 30 years ago, communist China was a poor, very poor and weak authoritarian state. And today, the communist China is a very rich and powerful authoritarian state. So the economic picture changed, but the underlying true nature of the party under the regime has not changed. And unfortunately, even today, not many politicians and foreign policy experts has realized that.
Okay, there was a speech given by Mike Pompeo, who was President Trump's Secretary of State. He gave it last July, and you wrote about it in your book. It's so interesting, all the political philosophy tying into then foreign policy. What is a smart thing for America to do? But Pompeo gave a speech on July 23rd, and he basically talked. It was in connection with the U.S. government having ordered the closing of the Communist China of the consulate in Houston, the China consulate in Houston. And the speech basically, he talked about the idea that the past 4 decades of blind engagement policy toward China were a failure. And he summarized the Trump administration's new China policy in 2 words: induce change. President Reagan's famous phrase, trust but verify, to distrust and verify. Did you, and I'm sure you've been watching American politics and how different administrations deal with China, did you feel like President Trump's term with Mike Pompeo as his Secretary of State, did you feel that they were too harsh on China and that they harmed America's relation with China by President Trump being more, in a variety of ways, more firm with China? Was that a good thing or a bad thing for us to do?
Well, so President Trump, the Trump administration's foreign policy approach to China was definitely 180-degree of shift compared to previous administrations from Nixon and onward. And so whether you say it's a harsh, whether his China policy is harsh, it depends on, you need to put it in the historical context. We just discussed earlier that the previous administration, whether under Democrats or Republicans, this whole engagement first, and let's talk about the economic approach, and let's talk about trade. Let's focus on commerce. Human rights, ideology, those things can come separately, which many times they never come. So throughout those 3 decades of this misguided approach, that it was a failure, because today's China is much, again, like I said, it's a much powerful, rich, but still authoritarian. And because it's so rich and powerful, today's communist China has now more leverage to use its economic coercion and backed by growing military power to force United States and our allies, our liberal allies, to compel to China's will, the Communist Party's will. And so I believe that the Trump administration recognized that, and they were the first administration that willing to take a stand. And basically, United States was is still the only country who, in terms of economic power and military power, that is comparable to China, that has the ability to take a stand. And so the Trump administration had the political will, and they also they brought this realism into foreign policy that has been lacking for the last 30 years foreign policy approach. And so what they did, I believe, is it was necessary, and there are also some success there that unfortunately has been ignored by mainstream media.
Can you elaborate that? What success you believe flowed from the Trump policies toward China that the media hasn't reported?
Okay, so let's talk about trade. The trade war, many liberals hated it, and the Chamber of Commerce hated it, and many U.S. corporations hated it. And But the trade is one of the very few tools we have nowadays to basically compel China to change its behaviors. Because there's so many people that complain about technology theft, forced technology transfer, and China still keep a lot of sectors closed to foreign investors. And so through the trade war, the Trump administration basically upped the ante, and every time the Trump administration imposed a new round of tariff, China initially retaliated. But because China runs a huge trade surplus with the United States, after several rounds of back and forth, China ran out of ammunition. So eventually, China and the United States agreed with a phase one trade agreement. That was actually a very good trade agreement. I wrote an article about it. Unfortunately, not everything in the trade agreement was able to carry it out because it was interrupted by the pandemic. But even with that interruption, most recently, that China reported, and also U.S. Commerce reported, that the U.S. trade deficit with China has dropped billions of dollars. You would not hear, you probably haven't heard any mainstream media report that, because all they want to report was Trump's trade policy, trade war was a failure. But it was actually the first time in decades the U.S. trade deficit against China dropped billions of dollars. So not only that, it also forced China to change, some behaviors. So that's one example of success. And if you want to know more, there are other examples of success in the human rights front as well.
Okay, we have so many directions to go. I'm taking notes here. Okay, one thing I want to be sure and get clear about. We talked about the mindset or the mission of some people who embrace an ancient Chinese doctrine of the notion that the Chinese people should rule, and then today's Communist Party, Xi Jinping and his Communist Party, believe in that notion, and it's mixed in with communism and the Chinese people as the intended future rulers of the world. Before I ask my question, is that accurate?
Well, it's not entirely accurate, because when we talk about China, I think Secretary Pompeo has done a really good job. He's my favorite in the Trump administration.
Me too.
That he always separate the Communist Party versus the Chinese people. I mean, when it comes to Chinese people, number one, they are proud people because China has a great civilization, lasted for thousands of years. So naturally, they have right to be proud. And secondly, majority of the Chinese people are victims of the authoritarian rule of the Communist Party. If you read my first book, Confucius Never Said, I talk about a great Chinese famine. Within 3 years, an estimated 40 million Chinese people starving to death. So Chinese people suffer at the first hand. They are the victim of the Communist Party. So when we talk about the evil of the party, the ideology of the party, basically the Communist Party hijacked the Chinese culture, and they took advantage of the people's pride and used this to create this hodgepodge of China dream but they want to recreate this new world order that's not necessarily based on traditional Chinese culture, but based on this communist view that the Communist Party will call the shots. It's going to be a very illiberal world order. So we should make that distinction between the Chinese people versus the Communist Party.
Helen, I'm glad you said that. In case our listeners are tuning in the middle, I want to be sure and tell you we're speaking with Helen Raleigh, who wrote Backlash, How China's Aggression Has Backfired. She's the author. We have many more questions. I just want to be sure in case you tune in the middle. Helen, I'm sorry, I didn't ask my question well because I'm completely agreeing with you. And that's one question I wanted to go down was the Chinese people themselves, the millions of billions of people who live in China. The vast number of them have no role in the Chinese Communist Party, have no power, have no say, and really are not responsible for any of the misdeeds of the Chinese Communist Party. It's the Communist Party itself as ruler is extremely repressive, and so I could not agree more. It's very important to distinguish the communist people. What I was trying to ask earlier was this mission that some people accepted from ancient China, the idea that Chinese people should eventually rule the world, is become mixed up combined in the Xi Jinping current Chinese Communist Party. It's a Chinese people and communism, or the Chinese Party and communism that is intended itself to become controlling. I mean, it's not. I mean, it's the spread
Right.
of communism is at the core. Okay, so here's what I want to get at.
Yeah.
So they now have this, we talked on the show numerous times about this One Belt, One Road initiative, and this idea of the way in which China, Communist China, or the Chinese Communist Party, is trying to spread communism. And it is through something that actually sounded kind of friendly and good in the beginning from the American perspective. It's kind of reassert the Silk Road and have that be an avenue. But can you explain how this Chinese initiative, One Belt and One Road, what it is and how it's being used to actually spread China's world goal of expanding its power?
Right. So this One Belt, One Road, the revival of the Silk Road, was initially American idea, first promoted by former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, but because the Obama administration did not want to provide any fundings to it, so the idea kind of naturally died. But like so many things, a good idea came out that Americans immediately got picked up by the Chinese Communist Party, especially by its leader Xi Jinping. He immediately saw, with China's economic power, this One Belt, One Road project can become a great tool to advance China's geopolitical influence as well as economic power worldwide. So basically, this initiative consists of two routes. One is a land route connecting from China through the land, through central China to Middle East, then all the way to Europe. And then there's another route is through the sea route, same thing through the ocean from connecting China all the way to Africa. And the way it works is, China set up a development bank, and there are many countries signed up to the initiative. So basically, the way it works is China will go to a country and say, well, you need a port. And obviously, build a port costs a lot of money. And we will give you low interest financing from a Chinese state-owned bank. And but as a condition, you have to hire a Chinese state, a company to build it. And of course, we'll help you to boost the local economy. But it's all, BS, because when the host country hire the Chinese state company, what they do is they're gonna bring their Chinese workers from China to work on their land, and also they're gonna import materials like cement, steel, concrete, all those things. China has overcapacity anyway, so they're gonna bring all those. Basically, the host country really just provide a location. Everything else was provided by China, and those infrastructure projects usually is very expensive. Even though it's a low interest loan, but still it costs a lot of money. And so in the end, once the port is built, the countries cannot pay it back because mostly these countries are small developing countries. They couldn't pay it back. Then the Chinese government will come in to say, you know what, you don't have to pay it back, but in exchange for your loan forgiveness, you're gonna let me occupy or supposed to lease this port for 99 years. This is exactly what happened to Sri Lanka. So basically, China used the land in Sri Lanka, build a port Chinese military and the Chinese merchant ships can use, and also give them access to Indian Ocean that China doesn't have access to. Mm-hmm. So you can see just from this one example, why this is such a project that's is the Chinese government, is willing to support. It helps sustain employment for Chinese workers. It helps expand the markets for Chinese companies, and also create markets for excessive capacities, production capacities in China. And also it gives China strategic locations it didn't have, right? And it enabled China to be able to move its merchants as well as especially military, gives them a new post they can move around the world. And because the countries is trapped in debt, there are, the Chinese government can demand them so many more in the future. They basically, this poor countries became a vassal state.
Yes, and it's all part of a path of expanding China's hegemony, control. Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yes.
Truly amazing. More strategic than people realize, I think. I do have a bunch of things I want to be sure and hit with you there, because this is so interesting. I mean, America has begun studying China more than ever, I think, in the last maybe 12 years as their role in various international things occurs, and then, of course, in the last 4 years. So I want to briefly hit on the social credit system there. And, you know, I did a show, it's a couple of years ago, I think, and I was talking about the social credit system, and someone commented, oh, that is not really a big deal. I live in China, it's no big deal. You're exaggerating it. So how impactful, how harmful, what is it all about, the social credit system there?
Well, first of all, the social credit system in China is different from the credit system we have here. The credit system we have here are mostly based on your financial behavior and transaction history to determine if you are, credit worthy to, to obtain more new loans. But in China, the social credit system, they measure everything. They measure not only just your financial behavior, but also measure like, did you run a red light? Did you cross the street illegally? But they also measure things like, did you post anything that the government, criticizing the government? Did you have overseas connections with people who, are dissidents of the Chinese government? So it's much more comprehensive. And they also use a lot of data collected from like surveillance cameras everywhere, through the facial recognition. And it's the punishment, the reward and the punishment can be especially punishment can be especially excruciating. For example, if you posted something on China's internet criticizing the Chinese government, they're gonna take down your social credit score. Then you can be subjected to, you may not be able to get a promotion, your kids may not get to a good school district, you may not be able to borrow money, with a good interest, or they may not lend you any money at all, even you're willing to pay high interest. But worst of all, you may not be able to travel. You're forbidden to buy a train ticket, you're forbidden to buy an airline ticket. You're basically stuck. You basically be ostracized by the society. So it's something very scary. It's the 1984, the book 1984 is George Orwell's nightmare that's been digitalized and presented. And so it keeps 1.4 billion people under the tight fist control of the Communist Party, for a way for them to suppress dissent. So it is a very scary system. People who say it's no big deal, they really do not know anything about it.
I'm so glad to have that explanation. It's honestly kind of giving me chills thinking about it. It is like 1984. I want to turn now to the COVID crisis we've had, the pandemic in this world. I noticed that there was there's an announcement today that the WHO, World Health Organization, the WHO team has concluded their investigation in China and says coronavirus is unlikely to have leaked from a China lab. And Helen, I found one of your tweets I sent to Matt, the wonderful producer. If you can put that tweet up, you tweeted about that. I think I sent it to him. Yeah, okay. So the tweet from Associated Press says, breaking, expert with World Health Organization in Wuhan says coronavirus leaked from a Chinese lab, unlikely, most probably jumped to human via intermediary species. You responded, this shouldn't come as a surprise. Given World Health Organization's history of shameful kowtowing to Beijing, we shouldn't expect its so-called investigation in Wuhan is anything but a farce. Can you tell me why you put that up there? What is your perception of the World Health Organization investigating Wuhan as to the source of the COVID?
Well, in that tweet, I also linked the article I wrote about the WHO's behavior from the last February, in the early days of the pandemic. Basically, and also there's a chapter about the WHO's behavior in the book. I consider WHO is one of the victims of the pandemic because it totally lost its credibility in this pandemic, just based on how they kowtowing to Beijing. Especially in the early days. Remember, the WHO's director, even with everybody urging them to declare emergency, to declare this is a pandemic, and he waited for almost a month to declare the pandemic. And even though there has been clear evidence that the Communist Party covered up the the truth, the facts about the virus. They were suppressing of early whistleblowers. They were suppressing, discussions on internet about this virus, in those early weeks. And yet WHO's director consistently couldn't stop praising about the China being, transparent and being open, even though we learned later from Reuters report that, while the director was praising Beijing out in the open, their scientists and experts were complaining about how little information they're receiving from China. I mean, based on the WHO's rules, any country is legally obligated to share those information about the virus as soon as they can and with full transparency, something that China did not do, especially in those early days of the pandemic. So for WHO now to say, well, they didn't find anything, it's expected, because it took them a year before China even allowed them to even go there. And I also know that during their trip in Wuhan, they spent time to visit the museum, after everything's already been scrubbed, yeah. So after all the labs been scrubbed, after the market has been scrubbed, I'm surprised they are going to find anything. So yeah, I just think that this is totally farce at all.
Well said. Last question. Honestly, this is so fun. I could do it all day. But last question for this time. So you grew up in China. You're clearly a student of the Chinese Communist Party, aware of the impact of culture, of socialist/communist policies and ideology, watching what's happening in China. Are you concerned about any trends you see in America today, in our political scene, that seem to be more embracing of socialism and maybe even further left than socialism? Do you see trends that you're concerned about in America today?
Oh, yes, absolutely. I see so many. I'm really disheartened. I'm concerned that the illiberal movement in the United States is making the United States more and more resemble the countries I left behind, the authoritarian regime. Just for example, the increasing intolerance of dissenting voices. One of the lessons we should learn from COVID-19 is the fact that China suppressed dissenting voices. It's one way to cover it up. Had China be more open and transparent, we probably would not have a global pandemic. And yet that's a lesson failed with the American liberals. And today you see they want to blacklisting not just the people who committed riot. I totally support they punish people who commit riots. But they also want to blacklisting all the Trump officials. They want to blacklist the Republicans, and they want to, get the Fox News off the air, get the Newsmax off the air. They do not have any tolerance for dissenting voice. And also this whole woke movement, this whole struggle session, we see more and more struggle session even happened not just with the conservatives, but also happen with the liberals themselves, that somebody is not woke enough, like this New York Times science reporter, that he just repeated a racial slur in a question. In his, try to understand the question, he was forced to resign. And the letter he wrote is no different. It used the same kind of language that a Chinese has to do self-confession in China. So I see more and more resemblance of this illiberal movement to a authoritarian, trend, and it's just really, really worrisome. And one thing America has, that we have is as you mentioned at your beginning, is the freedom of speech. That is so important. That is one of the foundation, a pillar of our free society. We can have a debate of different ideas. We don't always have to agree, but the fact that we have different ideas, that all ideas flourishing and may the best ideas win, that's what has prompted our country to prosper, to be so successful the last more than 200 years. And if we lose that, we're going to lose our liberty and the freedom, in no time.
Helen Raleigh, that was a beautiful answer, and thank you so very much. I also meant to commend you. I'm going to show our listeners again your book, Backlash, How China's Aggression Has Backfired. I want to tell you, there is a much better picture. Okay, tell you, my very fine listeners and friends, it It is a serious substance and great read. I mean, it's so well written. Helen, I want to commend you in your writing, your scope of history, that it's footnoted. It is just a pleasure to read. So, Helen Raleigh, I hope to come on again sometime, and thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.